So this is the third video of four about the law and compensation and benefits. Here we're going to go through more laws related to protected classes, and then we'll start getting into benefits, laws around benefits. So, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 is the next law in the book. This requires that our job descriptions include the essential functions of a job. The essential functions of a job are the tasks that a person has to be able to do as part of this job because no one else can do those tasks. That's part of that specific job description. It is very possible and very common that in a job description you have essential functions, but there also are tasks that are not essential to that job, but usually the person in that job would do them. Those tasks that are not essential functions, someone with a disability may be able to do the job without having to do those. You might have some other workers doing some of those tasks if that's the case. By having the essential functions written into a job description and identifying what those essential functions are in the job description, this allows a person with a disability to determine if they can perform those essential functions of a job with or without an accommodation. If they need an accommodation to perform those essential functions of a job, they have to inform the employer that they need the accommodation. It's not incumbent on the employer to figure out if an accommodation is needed. Although it may be very helpful if you are in HR, if, for example, you have an employee who's been doing a really good job and all of a sudden they're not, to help kind of problem solve with them why they may not be doing a good job. It's very possible they're having some health issues. Maybe their vision is starting to deteriorate, where you could help them figure out, oh, you might need an accommodation to do this job and then help them do that as well. HR doesn't have no role. It just means that it's really incumbent on the employee, if they do know they need an accommodation, to inform the employer. And when I say accommodation, I mean a modification that somehow allows that qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of the job. They have to already have the experience, the skills necessary to do the job. They just need this modification in order to do it well. What is considered an appropriate accommodation is dependent on the organization that has to make the accommodation. If you are in a workplace with very few employees, it's just a small business that doesn't have a lot of money, some accommodations may be so costly that they would put you out of business, in which case a court would not require you to make that accommodation. Just a very simple example that has been in case law before is an elevator. Say you're on the second floor of a building, you're a small office, this is where you do your work. And you have someone who uses a wheelchair who's applying for a job, and they actually have no way to get into your office right now because it's only stairs that go up to that second floor. If you are a small business, when I say small, I'm thinking 5, 10, even maybe 20 people. To put an elevator into that building may be so costly that you would be put out of business. You may not have to make that accommodation. It may just be that that person can't apply for that job because you're too small to accommodate, to make the accommodation for them to do the essential functions. However, if you work in a very large company that has hundreds of employees, maybe you own your office building and this happens, you may be required to put in an elevator because it's not very costly for you. You're not going to go under by adding an elevator into a building to allow someone with a disability who needs that elevator access to do their job. And in fact, it can probably benefit other employees as well, not just the employee with a disability. So the size of the organization matters in making accommodations. This is where having a legal team can be really helpful for HR to figure out if they can or should make those accommodations for someone with a disability. In this book, they talk a lot about tax laws. When we say tax laws, we only mean on benefits. We usually don't talk about tax laws in terms of income. There are income taxes, federal income tax and state income tax. That is usually not a part of the purview of HR. We just have HR would want to make sure that those taxes are coming out of people's paychecks when they're supposed to. And there are certain employees where they don't have to because of the status of that employee. The employee may pay their own taxes. But that's really HR. That's all HR really does in terms of income taxes. Um, with benefit taxes, it's the same, but there may be rules around who, like how much and who gets those benefit taxes and when those taxes get taken out. So with benefits, for example, you may have a lot of benefits where they're deferred income and that's not taxed until the employee takes advantage of the benefit. So an example would be if you have a retirement plan. Most of the time, the money, the contribution that an employee makes to their own retirement plan will come out before their taxes. So, say like in mine, I take I think it's 5.5% of my income goes to my retirement plan, they will take out 5.5% of my gross income before taxes to determine what 5.5% is. And then that's what gets matched by my employer as part of my retirement plan. This is true for pensions. When the book says pensions, they mean retirement plans. I will tell you specifically what a pension is in a later, in the fourth video. Profit sharing plans. This is where employers have, when they make profits, they may share this with employees as a bonus in every quarter or every year. That would be part of their pre-tax income. And then employee stock ownership plans where employees can put money into the organization's stock, their employer's stock, and then take it out later for retirement. That would be the money they're putting into that stock would be pre-tax, and then when they take it out later, it would be taxed. Some of benefits are not taxed. A lot of these, for example, with retirement plans, health insurance is another example. They're not taxed because we want to encourage, the government wants to encourage employers to provide these benefits, and they want to discourage other kinds of benefits. So if something is a taxable benefit, it's to discourage the benefit, or at the very least, not to encourage employers to provide it. An example of this would be services or perks that executives or tax that executives get. Those are often after tax income. So things like having use of a private car or private jet or something like that that only executives in the company get. Those are all benefits that are from taxed income, and they're taxed as part of the benefits package for that employee because it's not given to all employees. And it's not something the federal government is necessarily trying to encourage employers to provide, although they'll usually provide it anyway for competitive purposes. So let's talk about the first one. This is the biggest one. This is OASDHI. We never call it that in HR. We usually call it Social Security or Medicare, depending on what part of it we're talking about. But what's handy about this big old abbreviation is that it tells you everything that's included in this particular law. It's called the Old Age Survivors Disability and Health Insurance Program. This covers 9 in 10 U.S. workers, except for federal civilian workers who are in the federal retirement system, because they're already covered by that federal retirement system, which is what Social Security is essentially. State and local government employees who've chosen not to participate. This is very few employees, but every once in a while there are some who don't. They may have their own state or local plan that they prefer, but it's only government employees. It's not private employers here. I want to point that out. Some agricultural and domestic workers are not part of this program. This is unfortunately a racist legacy of the people who wrote this law. This was written in the Great Depression, around the Great Depression, and they wanted to keep African Americans out of some of these benefit plans, out of getting some of these benefits essentially from the government. And so a lot of African Americans at the time worked in agricultural, usually as farmers or working for some kind of farm, even if they usually didn't own the farm themselves, or domestic workers. This usually meant people who were like cleaning houses or taking care of children, like nannies. They excluded those workers so that a significant chunk of the population wouldn't be part of the retirement plans. And since then, our Congress hasn't ever updated the law, so they haven't started including these kinds of jobs in the Social Security plan. And then employees of some nonprofit organizations who have not arranged coverage. A lot of these can be international organizations, for example, where they may have other kinds of retirement plans available. They're usually not part of Social Security. You may or may not work for some of these organizations. I've never worked for an organization where people didn't have to pay Social Security, Medicare taxes, but if you do, be aware there just are some organizations that don't have to do this. So what are some of the provisions of this particular law? It provides retirement, survivors benefits, and disability insurance for workers. It provides hospital and medical insurance for older individuals and those with disabilities. So that's Medicare, and that's the Medicare program. It provides black lung benefits for coal miners. This is a disease that coal miners get, especially when they weren't wearing masks, but even since. That is very expensive to treat. And it generally kills these coal miners because they're getting coal in their lungs and it's irritating their lungs and creating a lot of problems for them in breathing. They eventually become disabled from it. Those benefits come out of this law. Supplementary security income, Social Security essentially, unemployment insurance, and then public assistance and welfare services. So let's go through more specific parts of the provisions. And on this slide, I'm including the Social Security Administration creates these really great infographics around how Social Security works. I've provided one of them here. If you want to Google these after you're looking at these slides, I would look into it because they're very informative. And I use them a lot in my in-person classes to explain Social Security and Medicare. So for Social Security, 6.2% of your wages will come out of your paycheck to pay for Social Security. Um, so that's how much are taken is taken out of your wages and your gross wages to pay for Social Security. So you pay 6.2%. Your employer will also pay 6.2%. So the employer has to pay half of these taxes with the employee. So your contribution is always met by your employer as well. Social Security does have a limit though. Once you make for 2025, the limit is $176,100. Any dollar you make above that amount is not charged Social Security. You don't pay taxes on that amount of money. This is potentially one problem with Social Security. One reason we don't have more Social Security money in the system. So people with higher incomes don't pay as much Social Security as people who make less than that $176,100. It's a potential fix, or at least one fix for this program, but that would require Congress to actually pass a law and change that cap or get rid of the cap altogether. For Medicare, 1.45% of your gross wages goes to Medicare. You pay 1.45%, and then your employer also pays 1.45%. But Medicare works differently from Social Security. If you make an income of over either $200,000 if you're a single filer for taxes, or $250,000 if you're a couple that files jointly, the all of the money that you make above those amounts is it's taxed at 1.45%, and it gets an additional tax of 0.9% for Medicare. So essentially, Social Security and Medicare deal with people who are high income individuals very differently. So Medicare doesn't have the same problem Social Security does, partially because of the way that it is paid for. What this money does is it goes into the system that we have now, and your current contributions help pay for the people who are currently on Social Security and Medicare. There's not an account that's designated just for you where it's counting how much money you put into the system. However, Social Security is keeping tabs on how much money over your lifetime you've put into the system. One, to figure out when you're eligible to start taking it out, but also to figure out how much you can take out once you are eligible. And how much you can take out will depend on how long you've worked, how much you made when you were working, and then what age you are once you retire. And that's what's in the Social Security Administration. That's where they have a lot of infographics about that are really helpful at figuring that stuff out. So I just want to emphasize here what we call FICA, the Federal Insurance Contributions Act. FICA is the act that requires these two taxes being taken out, your Social Security tax and your Medicare tax. These two taxes, you pay half of it and your employer pays the other half. Unemployment insurance works differently. It's also part of the OASDHI law, but this is a state administered program, and these taxes are paid completely by employers, at least at the federal level, and for most states that's also true as well. And what unemployment insurance does is it partially replaces income when a worker loses a job through no fault of their own, which means that they didn't leave the job because they went to go get another job. It also means that they didn't get discharged for cause, meaning they didn't break the law or break some kind of regulation and then got fired from their job for breaking that rule or breaking that law. So this is generally funded by state taxes on employers. And I just put the graphic here from Kansas. This can be different in other states as well, but unemployment insurance here is paid for by federal unemployment taxes that are paid by employers, and then a state unemployment tax that's also paid by employers. And then the state of Kansas is the one who administers the program. So that means that the state decides how much people will get and how long they can take that money out for unemployment. A lot of states changed these laws temporarily during the pandemic because so many people needed unemployment insurance. So that you could see where, and if you remember this, some people in some states could take unemployment out for many more months than in other states. The max was different in different states, so it just depended on where you lived, how much you could take out for unemployment insurance during the pandemic, which is also always true. Unemployment insurance is just different from state to state because it's state administered. We also have workers' compensation. This is another state administered program. This covers people who are either injured or become ill while they're on the job. So it can provide medical care and income while workers can't work because they were injured or because they got ill. It can also pay if they become disabled such that they can't work for the rest of their lives. It can pay some amount of money to that worker to pay for the fact that they can no longer work. It also provides support to dependents if a worker is killed on the job, and dependents would be people who are considered dependents for tax purposes for that particular worker. And the idea here is that worker was an important facet of their family for bringing in income, and that those dependents who cannot work, because they're usually children, were dependent on that worker for making sure that they had their living expenses. And so the workers' compensation program covers those living expenses for those dependents. The benefits are based on the worker's wages at the time of the injury or illness and the number of dependents they have. So the more money you make or the more dependents you have, the more the workers' compensation system will pay out for an injury or an illness. And again, these are governed by state laws that determine the maximum and minimum payments. So it depends on where you live, how much you can get in workers' compensation, and how long you can take those benefits depending on what your injury or illness is.